I'm delighted to be joined by Trevor Waldock, an expert in developing leadership. And Trevor leads the for-profit company, The Executive Coach, as well as the not-for-profit organisation Emerging Leaders, which is the focus of our discussion tonight as we look at the question, how are we going to grow a generation of leaders to deal with the many issues we're faced today?
Great, good to be with you.
So just to start with, what was the motivation for Emerging Leaders? How did that come about?
Well, I think it came from a number of directions. So one was working with leaders and investing in leadership development, and it being treated a bit like wine tasting really here in the West, as in lots of money, tens of thousands of pounds being spent on developing leaders and people turning up or not turning up. And so there was that side. The big thing for me then was going out to Africa for the first time. So I'd traveled, but I'd not been to Africa, and I'd got out there because my for-profit company had funded setting up a school in one of the slums on the edge of Lusaka. So they'd asked me to go out and assess the school and whether it was working or not. And I said, well, I don't know anything about this stuff. And they said, well, your job is to look at whether organizations are working or not working. So I said, yes, but I've not done that in Africa. They said, well, just come. So I literally got off the plane and went into the slums, the townships of Lusaka, and was just horrified. I mean, it was a very visceral reaction to what I saw. And an example of that was walking around with one of the guys and seeing this little girl there, and I said, how often would she get to eat? And he'd say, well, she probably gets a meal about once every 2 or 3 days. And it was that profound sense of this is not okay, this is not okay. So it was like, well, what can I do? We'd given some money, but I didn't want to, giving money isn't a sustainable answer. The first aha moment for me was realizing that every sustainable change anywhere in the world comes through leadership. Change and sustainable change needs good leadership. And I began to encounter, people set up clinics, but those clinics needed leadership. Even grandmas looking after 6 orphans in a township, if they're not leading that group of kids well, it has an effect. So leadership sits at the heart of all sustainable change. And that's what I do. I develop leaders. So that was one thing. Second thing was profoundly around injustice, is it's not okay that where you are born should determine your access to the best leadership development. Because people are moaning all the time about Africa, Africa's leadership, Africa's this and all the rest of it. But you kind of want to say, but how many centuries of investment have we had around good leadership development to get to where we've got to? And we can't say that we're an uncorrupt nation or nations even in the West. But what I thought was, I don't want to be sitting here at the end of my life still hearing people say that. Because what I was saying, well, who is investing? Who's actually investing into communities around Africa? Really good leadership development. So that was another motivation. And the third motivation for me was the issue of principles, that like the law of gravity is a principle. That part of my background was to understand the principles of leadership. So if you could distill what are the principles of leadership, then they should work anywhere in the world. So it shouldn't matter whether you were born with no education in a slum in Lusaka or had had a brilliant education in the West or whatever. The principles should work the same. So that was another motivator. I was just curious, does really good leadership development actually work? I guess the other bit to say in that was I watched lots of donor dollars being poured into the top of the system. People were saying people are living on less than $1 a day, let's do all these things to change that. What I found as I walked around was the people who are living on less than $1 a day don't get any of this money. It's not actually impacting them. So I just made a decision that what they're doing from the top down, it's great, and I think all of it's necessary to work at all levels. But what I said is, let's work from the bottom up. Let's bring the best leadership development into the grassroots of the most vulnerable communities in the world.
So I guess that leads on to what kind of skills do you actually teach? What are the principles? What are the skills that can be transferable across any culture, nation, etc.?
So let me just distill a few. When everyone talks about leadership, my first question is, well, what do you mean by leadership? Because everyone's using the leadership word. So let me start with a definition that we work with, and I use it all over the world, whether it's to people who live on less than $1 a day or investment bankers. And it's Gardner's definition. Gardner works out of Harvard and books like Leading Minds, things like that. He says that leadership is the ability to create a story that affects the thoughts, feelings, and actions of other people. And the reason why I use that is because we're all in a story, and I teach that notion of story. We're all in a story. We know about pretend stories and fantasy stories once upon a time, but then we're all in real stories. As you and I both have an autobiography, and we're writing it even now as we speak. We're in a story. And the issue around leadership for me is who gets to write the story. So leadership is the ability to write the story that affects the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others. So the very first thing we want to get across to people is, you're in a story, who's got the pen? Because the issue of hopelessness in lots of communities is someone else has got the pen. Oh, I'm not a leader, I can't do anything about this. You see all those things. And I want to get across to our people the idea that we're often caught up in stories that aren't true. So take the issue of HIV/AIDS. A lot of people's behavior that sees the ongoing transmission of AIDS comes out of hopelessness. So you watch teenagers that will go and infecting other teenagers because they believe the future is hopeless. That if I get tested and I'm found to be positive, then I'm going to die, therefore it's hopeless, so it doesn't matter what my behavior is. But that's not true, it's a lie. So what you want to help people understand is that our lives are shaped by other people's stories, so someone else has got the pen. So that's the first thing, is understanding this notion of story. And then the second thing is just taking really simple things. I mean, people get paid lots of money in academia, but actually strategic thinking is very simple. You know, leadership essentially is about how do you get from here to there? And how do you get a bunch of people from here to there? Or how do you take this issue from here to there? So that's a principle. So story is a principle, here to there is a principle. Leadership takes place at different levels. So at the very basic level, you can lead your own life, because if you don't lead your life, someone else is. So everybody's a leader. That's a principle. Everybody can lead their own relationships. That's a principle. You can therefore then begin to lead small groups of people in your community or workplace. You can work all the way up to leading organizations. A lot of people think I'm not a leader because I'm not the president, I'm not the prime minister, I'm not the CEO, I'm not the chief, I'm not the this, the that. So another principle we teach is everybody's a leader. Now, clearly not everybody is going to be a president or a prime minister, not everyone's going to be a chief exec, but everybody is a leader. So they're kind of examples of that. And we work through about 7 different mindsets, because, you know, the biggest issue, whether it's getting out of poverty or breaking the paradigm of how you need to think about investment banking, is in here. Is that our minds are set down certain railway tracks that limit the way we think, therefore limit the way we deal with things. So there are mindsets that leaders have. So we teach those mindsets. And because they're principles, I mean, I get to teach this stuff too. The emerging leaders of the corporate world, as well as to people who live on less than $1 a day. And I can honestly say they get exactly the same stuff.
And do you find they react similarly to these mindsets, or because they're such massive worlds apart? I mean, do you find there are similarities?
I think the similarity is impact. There is always an impact. I have to say the impact in Africa is much more marked and instant than you see in the West. And it's a slight generalization, but not too much. What I notice in the West is what I mentioned is this wine tasting mentality, is you can teach this stuff and people are like, oh yes, let's take a sip of that. And if I like it, I might use it. And you're sitting there thinking, this stuff works. You know, there has been no sustainable change unless, take a mindset, be proactive. All leaders are proactive. They're on their front foot. They're not reacting, they're acting. They're shaping the future. They're writing the story. Well, you teach that as a principle, and some people you watch, I think in the West, taste that like a sip of wine. What you notice in Africa is people are so hungry that what you teach they use instantly. And I could give you countless stories about all kinds of ways in which individually, relationally, groups and communities change just by inputting.
Is the intention for short-term and long-term, or is there a focus at the moment which is particularly on just short-term, trying to get things up and running, or what's your focus? And are there a couple of examples of something that stands out in your mind, a particular story that can kind of bring it to life for us?
I mean, in one sense, the focus is always long-term, because, you know, the passion that drives us is how do we play our part in investing in the next generation of leadership development in the world. And particularly for us, it's in communities where people don't have access. Like I say, it's how do we get it so that in the next generation people aren't still saying, oh, there's a problem with leadership in Africa or Asia or wherever it is. So we definitely have a long-term view, but the long-term has to start in the short term. It's like we have to start shifting mindsets. We have to see different stories being written in individuals, in their families, in their communities, in their workplaces. So there has to be a short-term impact. So let me give you some examples. Let me just follow one story. So one is we were working in Malawi, and there was a lady called Mara that we worked with. And what we were trying to understand is what would it mean to create a whole new generation of young leaders in Malawi. So out of that, we created what was called the Mara Project, because we want to put a local role model up front, not emerging leaders. So we worked with Mara, and out of that created a strategy. We sat down with the chiefs from the whole of the Lilongwe district and got their buy-in, and we got them to select 6 young people from each of the 18 districts, 3 male and 3 female, because we insist on gender equality. So we had 108 young people for 5 days, and we just poured these leadership principles into them for 5 days. Then at the end of 5 days, we said, right, now you need to go back into communities and come up with a project that will benefit your community, that will demonstrate these leadership principles. So they did that. I mean, they had to come up with an idea, which means they had to engage with their community, they had to engage with all the stakeholders, they had to form a team, they had to influence a team, they had to create a strategy, they had to do all the things that leaders do in the context of an outward-facing project. So they did that, we brought them back, did more input, and then off they went and ran their projects. Now, those 108 young people, let me just tell you a few stories. So one guy, Mafazo, 25 years old, goes back to his community, which is in the middle of nowhere on the borders near Mozambique, sits down with his chief, and they look at their area, and it's being, the forests are being cut down, they're burnt for charcoal, it has an effect on carbon emission, CO2 emissions, and it's affecting long-term income, it affects soil erosion, all these issues. They saw that issue, and he said, what can I do? Now, Mafazo, within 6 months, is now running 29 reforestation projects in 29 villages.
Fantastic.
Amazing. So that's just one young guy. Another guy, 28 years old, goes back in his community and said, there's nothing for young kids, preschool. I mean, education in Malawi is a huge issue anyway, but preschool education, massive, massive issue. So he's now set up 8 projects in 8 different villages, which now looks after 450 children preschool. So they're getting preschool education, and they're getting a cup of porridge every morning, which might sound a little thing, but when you weren't getting a cup of porridge in the morning, it's a big thing. So 28 years old, that's what he's doing. He doesn't get paid to do it. We didn't tell him to do that. We give him the principles. He goes back into his community, and he creates this whole project.
I suppose one question that you know, listening to that I have is, how do they fund that? Because obviously giving the skills is one thing, but then, which sounds fantastic, but then how do you, presumably they need funding to implement these things, or how does that work?
Well, yes and no, but part of the challenge for any of us is, money's a great thing, but money can make you lazy in the head. When you have no money, I think Andrew Rugasira, who set up the Good Africa Coffee Company, he said, have you ever tried to live on less than $1 a day? He said, you have to get really good with your head. You've got to really work out, how do I get through today? And if you look at, there's some great studies on, studies of how do people actually live on less than $1 a day? And they have amazing dexterity. So what you're helping them to do is, how do you use what you've got? So, you know, there are bits of land there. So what are they? They make their own bricks out of the mud that's there, and they make the bricks and they build their own child development centre.
So effectively it's giving them the tools to then go and do it themselves, rather than just pumping in money and then no one really using it efficiently.
Yeah. And if you flip that over to the West, and that's what I'm saying about lazy minds, is what the world needs are leaders now who can think outside of the box, who can think with no money, who can think outside of systems, who can think out of what is given into, well, what isn't there? What can I do? I was just talking to a guy the other day about a number of charities that are shutting down because they don't have enough money at the moment. Because they've got so used to the money, they think we can't operate. Well, if you've still got the founding people who've still got their founding skills, you can still do a lot of things with no money. And that's what we say. Even you can teach leadership development for free, actually. And even the ways that we teach it, we don't take laptops and laptop projectors, because if you're going to most of the places we go, you're lucky if you've even got electricity. So we just stick up paper on the wall, and we build the day's teaching on the wall, and we give them a sheet of paper that sums up that day's teaching, because it means they can sit down with their friend in the evening and say, this is what I learnt today. So it's trying to find those very practical ways. And then when they do need money is, let me give you another example. We worked with 130 street vendors in one of the villages in Uganda. 2 days of just putting in leadership development principles and entrepreneurial skills around leadership and taking an idea and setting up a business. We gave them enough to create a basic business plan, on the basis that if they went to a microfinance lender, the lender would say, what's your business plan? So we said, we want to give you enough so that you've got that. And so that's what we did. Now, 130 people, my colleague and I, we said at the end of that, now what would be success? If they came back in a month's time and we started looking at some of these business plans, how many would we expect to come back with a business plan? And we estimated, based on what we knew here in the West, we said 15%. Well, guess how many turned up? 100%. They'd all done the work, they'd all come back, they'd all got ideas, they were all working on it. So it's trying to help people be very creative with very little. And when we, even as emerging leaders, face massive issues over funding and how we do it, all the rest of it, and I say to my team all the time, I said, we're no different. We have to learn to keep on doing what we're doing when there's nothing. Because actually that's what we're trying to teach people, is how to, how to work in a world with nothing. The Puritans, that group from the 15th, 16th century said that you need revival every 3 generations. And what they meant by that is you've got the generation of the pioneers. These are the people who sweat stuff. They have no money, they have no resource, they just have a passion and a conviction, and they do it for no money. And then you get the next generation that come along that inherit what they've started. And then you start paying them, and then the systems get in place, and it gets a little bit more comfortable. And then you get the third generation who's saying, hey, we want more pay, we want more money, we're not going to do this if we don't get that, and all the rest of it. And they've lost those founding convictions. And I think really good leadership helps people to recover and stay close to passionate core convictions. And I think we need that all over the world right now, because we need the dexterity of a compass, because we don't have any maps.
And do you find that the people who learn the skills off you then actually do transfer that knowledge? It's sort of like it trickles out amongst the community, and they then teach those skills. Like you said, they've learnt it on their piece of paper on the board during the day, and then they go back and they talk to their friends in the evening. Do you find that's having a real impact?
Yeah, I think because Africa is a much more verbal culture and a community-based culture, we reckon that our upscale rate in terms of teaching others is somewhere between 1 to 20 to 100. And by that I mean if we teach one person, they will teach between 20 and 100 others. They just sit down with the youth group. They will just sit down in the communities. And it spreads. So if you take that pilot we ran in Malawi, we ran it with 18 young people. Well, because of the effect of that, those 18 young people within 8 weeks had probably impacted about 2,000 people in their community, which meant that the chiefs and the leaders of the community are saying, hey, we want this. So we went back and we had 30 community leaders for 2 days and just inputted on them. Now, as a result of that, and then we spent 3 days with another 140 young people, as a result of that, within 2 weeks, through the district youth officer, the district development officer, and the village chiefs have now created strategies for leadership development to move into the whole of Salima district, that it will get into every secondary school, every youth group, and every community leadership across the next 12 months. Now, we didn't tell them to do that. What we did is gave them the leadership principles, help them to lift up their head, look around and say, you can do this, you can do this, and they are. Now, they've still got massive challenges. How do we take this forward with, Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world with no resource. So there's massive battles that they have to fight.
And why do you think, why are leadership skills so transformative? I think you've probably answered that to some extent, but you know, if faced with that question, what would your response to be? Obviously it's what you do, it's your career, it's what you're passionate about, but for me, new to this subject, say, how can you convince me that this is really so important and transformative?
To me, it comes back to this issue of story, Sophie, is, you know, if you asked it as a personal question, I'd say, Sophie, who's got the pen? Because if you don't have the pen in your life, then someone else does. What's the story that you are writing with your life? Because you can do it. If you take that issue of authority, most leadership is seen to be the seat of authority. Well, authority, if you take that word author, sits at the heart of authority. Authority is simply who's got the pen. I think the transformative issue about leadership is you're putting the pen back in people's hands. It's actually, you can write the story in your life. You can write the story in your family. You can write the story in your community. You can write the story in your team at work. You can write the story in your organization. You know, when we look at Steve Jobs or Howard Schultz at Starbucks or whatever, what they've done is they had a story that they were passionate about and they wanted to write, and they did. And I think they are inspiring figures simply because they breathe life into us to say, all right, you might not be running a multinational, but hey, you can do that in your life, in your family, in whatever.
That was fantastic. And I think, you know, for you, for your organisation, what are the next steps? But also, how does that link into our sort of beginning question of leadership for facing these challenges today? But, you know, what are the next steps and the scalability of this?
The reason why we've been working in Malawi is to say how scalable is this. So we've worked in Malawi, because it's a relatively small, and I say that with a slight grin on my face, a relatively small country. But we're now moving more into looking at trying to take that into Uganda, which is a larger country. So we're all the time looking at, okay, how do you now scale that up? So we're working that out. So is it scalable? Yes, because it doesn't depend on us. Our job, I think, is to light a fire. If emerging leaders can do anything in this generation, it's to light a fire, it's to envision people about leadership and say, look, it's some core stuff. It's actually very simple, very simple. I actually think you can teach the principles of leadership to a 3-year-old. It's very simple. If we can envision you that this is possible, if we can equip you and give you all those principles, and then model it, which is all we do, is then model it with groups of people in their communities, and then give them the resource and say, okay, here it is. Now you go teach. Then there's no reason why we can't light a fire that spreads across a nation. So we're not trying to grow an organization. We're trying to grow a passion for leadership development and equip people. And that word empower literally means put the power into. Let other people take that story out. So that's kind of where we're going. So that's one part of it. But I think the interesting thing for us is, because of the work that we were doing, and I've been doing in Africa and different places, I come at from the other side because I teach leadership in the corporate world. And I was speaking in Barcelona earlier on last year at the Graduate Business Forum. Now, the Graduate Business Forum is the forum for the top 50 business schools in the world. And the mandate on them at this conference was this, is that to the business schools of the world, is that what the world needs are responsible leaders now. A generation of leaders who can look beyond themselves, beyond the walls of their organization, to the fact that you live in a highly interdependent, interconnected world. And how do you do that? And we'd already, out of our work in Africa, said, hey, do you know what? The way leadership is taught in the West is, it's not the whole story. Because if you look at most leadership models that are taught in the West, they're Western leadership models. Well, Africa has had a philosophy of leadership for generations. Asia has had countless millennia of input around this. So what we started saying is, let's look at all of the different cultures and say, is there a kind of unified view? And that's what we've done. So we've created what we call the integrated global leadership model, which is not meant to be reductionist. What we basically say is that to grow a generation of responsible leaders, whether you're living on less than $1 a day or whether you're on £150,000 a year, there are certain dimensions of that. And the biggest thing that we have seen when you look at it is that what the leadership models that are taught in the West lack is heart. And by that I mean this, is that leadership does not exist for me. It doesn't even exist for my company. It exists for others. And as soon as you turn and put the heart back into leadership, then you come up with a whole different story. Because actually, if you say it's about others, then we have to admit that we're not leading sustainable lives, most of us. So we start there, and then we say, actually, the biggest issue around leadership then is character. My character is the most influential factor. And we talk about, you know, African corruption, but there's masses of different kinds of corruption here in the West as well. That's a character issue. So out of our work in Africa, we've begun to shape what are the core dynamics of creating responsible leaders across the world. And what's really interesting is we have one of the big oil companies now that's actually using that model that we've created out of Africa into their global leadership development program. I sit and teach leadership now on global corporate leadership program for an investment bank, and it's this that they teach. So actually it's this work coming out of the poorest communities that I think is actually beginning to now shape and add something into the real debate about how do we create leaders for this generation.
So you're talking about the principles, the key principles,
yes.
and being able to teach these sort of across the board.
Yep.
Is that something that can cross culture? And obviously you were talking about sort of earning $1 or $150
yep.
a day, and it should be transferable to both.
Yes.
Is that the same across culture? Is that a problem? Have you experienced that yet?
No, I mean, I've taught in every culture, and the principles work. And I think the thing to separate is a principle isn't the same as a methodology. And that might be kind of a statement of the obvious, but so when we talk about principle, it is like having a compass. When you're lost on a mountain, a compass will tell you where is north, and from that you work out your route. It's different than having a map. A map tells you here's the road and you go this way and that way. So a lot of people want a map. The world that we're living in now, there are no maps. So whether you're living on less than $1 a day, or whether you're looking at an investment bank that's having to try and understand what does it mean to create a sustainable model, economic model for the next 100, 200 years, that you need the same principles because there aren't any maps. So in that sense, I'd say absolutely a principle can be taught in any culture and at any level.
And do you feel obviously your experience is sort of in the corporate world,
yep.
But again, is this something that you feel, again, these principles are across the board in academia, government, you know, corporate world, civil society, or do you feel very much that that's a sort of your starting point and you're not quite sure, you need to test these things?
My background is we've tested them in all of those domains. It's more, I suppose I'd like to see a more global view of leadership in the sense of these principles apply to anyone, cross-culturally, from any kind of background, and whether you are, and I've worked with university leaders, people who lead the universities, I've worked with the heads of, you know, investment banks, banking, law firms, all those corporate worlds, public sector. The principles are the same. At the end of the day, is they have to write a story. You know, if you're the chief exec of a hospital, is you've got to write the story. What does this hospital exist in this community for? Not today, just today, for the next 200 years. You know, what does healthcare need to look like for the next 200 years? Well, what we're talking about, what's the story? Well, how do you write that story? Well, the principles are the same. So it's just about distilling those. And my biggest thing really is I think we've made some of it just too complicated. And the reason why that is people like me can get paid lots of money in the corporate sector if it sounds more complicated. But a 3-year-old understands the notion of story. A 3-year-old understands the notion, actually, if you teach it properly, about leaders need to lift up their head. They understand different levels. They understand proactivity. They understand the notion of seeing and taking responsibility. If you take the principle and just teach it in the right way in its context, it does its work.
And you were talking earlier about the fact that leadership is about being there for others. It's
yes.
about what you can do for others, not just about, oh, I'm a leader, I want to do it for myself.
Yeah.
So can you sort of expand on that a bit more in terms of social corporate responsibility, I guess, springs to mind,
Sure.
you know, just to sort of understand that element a bit better.
So the heart of it for me is, you know, we want to grow leaders in the real world. Therefore, we should ask the question, well, what is the real world? And the real world is an interdependent reality. It's not an independent reality. Therefore, leaders in the real world need to be focused on interdependence, So a bank doesn't exist. Yeah, the thing that upsets me most, you say, why does your bank exist? And they say, well, it's for shareholder and shareholder value. And that's lazy thinking. It's lazy thinking. You don't just evolve for that. If you actually trace stories back, for most of the companies, why did you start? It's because the founders said, you know what, there's a big social need here. There's a need for making money available to people at all levels of society so that they can work their way out of poverty, and we need to make that movement of money easy for them to do those things. It was there as a service to help people do that. So if you trace organizations back to their roots, often they started in the right place. But that's what I said earlier on, that this notion of revival every 3 generations, people have forgotten why they exist. I talked with a bunch of people in one of the global banks recently, and I said, why does your company exist? And they said shareholder value. I said, no, it's not a good enough answer. Why does it exist in the world? See, that's what the heart of leadership should answer. Why do you exist in the world? For whose benefit do you exist? I listened to Chinua Achebe, the Nobel Prize winner for literature from Nigeria, and I had him speak at Cambridge recently. Amazing man of stature, speaking from his wheelchair for an hour. But he just said this, he said, leadership is a sacred trust. It's given to you on behalf of others. And that's the heart of it, is that when we inherit any position of leadership, whether it's for ourselves, our families, groups, whole organizations, it's not for me. I am in this position for you. Therefore, I should be looking outwards and saying, what are the issues, what are the needs, why do you exist? So I think that's where it starts. But then you then say, so I think this issue around corporate social responsibility and the way it's being framed can reflect, I think, a model that needs to change. And for me, it's the difference between charity and generosity. You see, what charity does is say, look, here is a circle, and what's in this circle is mine. And if things are going well, I will give off the edge of that circle. If things are going less well, I'll give less. And we see that. If you ask around charitable giving, right now it's down at least 30% across the board. Why? Because people are saying, I've got less money, therefore I'll give you less money. There's even discussions around the 0.7% GDP that everyone's committed to giving. Most countries aren't even giving it, and there are huge battles here even that we don't give it. What a nonsense in terms of that. Because what that's saying is, that's 0.7 off the edge. 0.7%. So the issue around the heart of leadership is, if it doesn't exist for me, it exists for others, then what needs to be at the heart of leadership is generosity, not charity. Generosity is about that what I do exists to benefit others. And we've got brilliant examples in our own history in the UK, whether you've got the Cadburys and the Bournevilles and the Clarks and all the rest of it, very heart-centered models of leadership. So how do we bring that back into the center? And there are people doing great work. So if you take Tom's Shoes, Blake McCluskey set that up. What he said is, how do you create a for-profit model that puts generosity at the middle? So every pair of shoes that you buy, a child with no shoes is getting a pair of shoes. Now for a pair of glasses that you buy, a child that needs some glasses is getting a pair of glasses. It's a for-profit model. It has to make a profit, it has to grow. So this is not anti-profit. This is about why do we exist and for whom do we exist. You could take something like White Box Digital that's saying, okay, how do we set up a not-for-profit social enterprise that's a global player? All right, so it's not even anti-globalized organizations, but it's saying, how do we set up an organization that can compete in the global market, but that's a social enterprise, so that any profit that's made is poured straight back into the core purposes around why does that organization exist. So people are working on that kind of thing, but it takes leadership to shift some of these things. You take some of the work that Tim Jackson did about prosperity without growth. Is we know that the economy that we have been growing is not sustainable. We know we can't sustain it. All of us are occupying or eating up between 3 and 6 planets more than actually exist. So given that we know these things, it's going to require great leadership and courageous leadership to write a different story. I mean, the word oikos, economy, literally came from the word household. It was the notion that we're all part of a household. And that whole notion of the bartering economy and all the rest of it came from, we're all part of a household and we've all got things to add and we should share. in order that the household can do well. So I think it's out there, it's been out there, something that we've lost that we need to regain.
And do you think there's an appetite for that?
I think there's a massive appetite. What encourages me most is if you look at graduates coming out of university, rather than the old kind of the organizations were going getting the cream of the graduates are now interviewing the organizations. And they're saying, what kind of organization are you? Because these issues matter to me. Do they matter to you? And what are you doing about it? So I think at that level, I'm massively encouraged by the generation of emerging leaders, and I want to invest in them as well, because I was speaking to a bunch of global young leaders recently, and I said to them, do you realize, I said, you are the most educated 0.01% in the whole world. And I said, I'm not saying that as a guilt thing, I'm saying it's because you've got an amazing opportunity and responsibility to shape the stories and use your leadership well in your lifetime. A lot of people that I work with is, you know, they leave university and they get a great job and they pursue this holy grail, and you say, well, where's the grail going? And actually they don't know. You say, well, it's to make money. Money for what? Money for... And I think what's most encouraging is a whole bunch of people are saying, nah, that doesn't really appeal anymore. And they're trying to ask and answer some of these questions. So I think there's some good signs. And I think if we talk about the global economy and what's happening is we've looked too long, you know, either we look down a political stream or a corporate stream or whatever. What we're seeing is it's going across. You know, the people are getting together and saying, do you know what, we can do something? And I think the normal structures of authorship don't like it, but I think people are saying, we don't like that story, we want to see a different story. So I think leadership is emerging now from all kinds of places, and I think that's what we can expect in the next couple of decades, is leadership's going to come from all kinds of places, because people are saying, actually, if you don't take a lead on this, we will.
Fantastic, thank you so much.
All right, pleasure.